Okay, I'm Sadie Bowen.
And I'm Kennedy Call.
And this week we read the book School, The Story of American Public Education, Part 1, from the 1770s to the 1900s on the Common School. So the book kind of started off talking about how school was not as important back then. They really didn't put as much of an emphasis on their learning and education. Children mostly got their education just from their neighbors or talking with others, or from like churches, but yeah, they didn't really go to schools to get an education. The only people who really did go to schools and get an education were those with wealth, and your gender and race really had a big impact on this, because you mostly had to be white and a guy to go get an education, and you had to have a lot of money to be sent to these schools. So with the new nation, the leaders felt that they needed to start a new and better school system once this became the Americas. And so they sought out people from everywhere, just kind of started like questioning what education was and how they should make it a common thing in our country.
Yeah, so going off of that, that's kind of the time when public school as we know it was born. Mm-hmm. This was during the mid-19th century, so the 1800s, and these schools were called common schools. And these were funded by local property taxes. You were charged tuition, so it made it much more available to everyone. They were open to all white children, so once again, race still played a huge role in that. They were governed by local school communities, similar to like school districts that we see now. And state regulations were a big part of it, because the standards were set and enforced by the state. And at this time, though, they were still not widely spread because only really the big cities had them, and so that left the small cities without much. But even then, the schools were really small. But they still felt so strongly about education. Someone named Nancy Hoffman said that children may be about 20% of the population, but they're 100% of the future. And so that was their big thing at that time, was how important education was for students and getting that going. Thomas Jefferson also felt very strongly about this and said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. And he just knew that if the children weren't educated in any way, there wasn't going to be a nation to continue.
Yeah, Jefferson, I feel like he was one of the main people that wanted kids to start getting an education. He wanted everyone to go to at least 3 years of public school and felt it was necessary for them to become like good members of society, I feel like. But his ideas didn't start taking root till like the 1830s or 40s. And like she was talking about, common schools were first kind of created by this guy named Horace Mann, and he was the big one that really felt that all people should have an education, and so he made schools public and kind of the same everywhere. He started to try and get that so everyone could have an education and more of an equal opportunity.
Yeah, and he was trying to make sure that they were all like clean, or they all had books or desks, and so kind of leveled out,
for sure.
Standardized the education, I guess.
Yeah.
One of the big problems at this time was, now that we did have an education system and that it was running, and that Horace Mann made sure that that was all kind of evened out more, they had curriculums, but these curriculums were often very Protestant based, out of the Protestant Bible, and were oftentimes very anti-Irish and anti-Catholic, which was a problem because now our nation had grown, and so there were immigrants that were coming in, and a lot of them were Irish, and so now they were being kind of discriminated against in the schools, and so these students refused to be part of this system, and so there were many children just without an education, which is troublesome because everybody needs to go to school, and so there was a guy named Bishop Hughes who demanded that city funds would be available for Catholic schools, if everything else was Protestant, right? And so, but once he did that, the Jews and the Presbyterians were like, hey, this isn't fair, and so they also asked for funds. And then this led to a debate, and they kind of fought to have more leveled playing fields as far as education goes for everyone. And ultimately, this led to them cleaning up the textbooks and taking away the anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-whatever, and making sure that it was more equal to everybody.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah.
Also, the same thing kind of happened with African Americans. They did have their own schools originally, but they were really bad and they cost a lot of money and they got a really poor education. And so they also fought, and this one guy sued, and his name was Roberts, and he tried to get his daughter to get to a school for American kids. And so finally, segregation did end, though it still wasn't perfect. It was eventually abolished, so they could all go to the same schools.
A long time from then.
Yes.
Long time. And then another big thing that happened was this shift where teachers previously were mostly male, which makes sense because time-wise people didn't really see women as people. But women were seen fit to be teachers, and it was often said that that to be a teacher was a woman's moral calling. And Catherine Beecher was really a big proponent of that. And part of this was so revolutionary because it added a sense of care rather than just strict discipline. The male teachers were very disciplinary and very strict, and it made it a harsh environment. And with that, everything softened a little more, and students began to enjoy it more, and curriculum expanded to not only just the 3 R's, the arithmetic, writing, and reading, but also physiology, biology, zoology, ichthyology. And so it just became a much more well-rounded education, and not so strict and just so focused on just one thing. It was like I said, well-rounded, which at the end of the 19th century led to an explosion of schools and the number of the students attending, and so that's kind of where education began.
Next, we're going to talk a little about the praxis and what we want to do better in our classrooms. So in my classroom, I think I'm going to try my best to give students a good experience learning, the best experience possible, because back then they didn't have very many good experiences, so I want to make learning a good experience for students.
And kind of along similar lines, but also, like I was saying, when the women came, it shifted to more care. And so just in my classroom, I want to continue that, to have the students know that they can trust me, and have it be a comfortable classroom where that learning environment is safe, because they're more apt for them to want to come back and to come every day and to learn and be more comfortable making mistakes or trying new things. And so that makes them want to have an education. And so in my classroom, I want my students to want to come to school.
Totally. I also think it's important that everyone is treated fairly when it comes to learning in schools, because as we saw back then, there was so much segregation and gender stuff, and they were all treated differently, and it just wasn't fair. And so in my classroom, I think it's going to be really important for everyone to get an equal chance. I'm not going to treat anyone differently based off their race or gender or anything, and everyone will have an equal opportunity to learn and do whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the same idea for me. That was one of the big takeaways from this chapter. So in my classroom, I want to use language and actions that are inclusive, that avoid any form of discrimination to any group of students, because as we see, there's been troubles with that in the past, and that really limits the child's education. And it's amazing how far we've come today from the times that we're reading about in this book, but I know that it's important still now that we use inclusive language and are mindful of the students that are in our classroom.
Totally. And also kind of like what you said for your first point, in my classroom also, I really want to make sure the students are all cared for and know that like how important they are and loved they are. I want the classroom to be like a loving environment, because back then, as we read, before women started teaching, it was more, they only really focused on what they were learning, and there was really no care for the students. There was no connection between teacher and student. But in my classroom, I want my students to know that it's like a safe place and that I care for them and everything like that. So I want them to know that, yeah, I care about their well-being, and it matters what they're feeling and stuff.
Yeah, just like what we read about last week, it still all connects. So now for the reflection, I was thinking about how, well, school might look a little different today, or a lot different in some ways, We have different curriculums, but the purpose is the same, to create students who are, or to create citizens who are well educated and want to be moral and civil leaders in their communities and homes. And just like what Jefferson was saying, how important it is, I think that's one of the biggest things about school, is that ultimately these children are able to go out into their communities and be someone.
Totally.
And further.
Yeah, I agree. I thought the big takeaway was that school, it's always been important for children to learn. People have always wanted children to learn and get an education. It was just a lot different back then. But the main reason for school is to learn to then become productive members of society, like it has always been. And our school systems, I think they have greatly improved over time. As demonstrated by this book, they were really different back then, but now they are a lot better, but we still have a long way to improve, but schools for sure have gotten a lot better. So.
Yeah. Thank you.